have joined us, welcome. And Pat, I would like you to go ahead and take over at this point.
Hello, my name is Pat Grout. I'm the Executive Director for Iowa International Center. I want to thank you all for attending and welcome you to our global conversation today. You might or might not know that Iowa International Center's vision is really one of a single global community, to create that global community. It's a little hard right now as we go through the COVID virus and all its fallout, but we still want to connect people across the world to Iowa, and we want to connect Iowa to the world. It's as vital now as it's ever been, and as we get through this coronavirus, it will be even more important on the backside. So what we're doing today is bringing people together, and we're really delighted that you are here. Today we're going to talk with some journalism, and we're going to talk about journalists, and we're going to talk about disinformation. If you were in on the pre-show, thanks for the heads up that everybody was listening. I want to tell you that you really are in for a great conversation, and we're looking forward to it. Janet Norton is our Manager of International Programs, and she is going to moderate for us today. So I'm going to turn it back over to Janet and listen intently. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Pat. Before we do jump in, I would like to go over just a few technical details, and I understand that many of you probably already know these by heart, but just as a reminder, those of you who are attendees are all muted. There is the possibility that you might be on video from our panelist side, so kind of keep that in mind, but the attendees cannot see each other. We do encourage you to ask questions today. We really hope that some of our discussion will prompt some other things that are on your minds. And so if you would please use the chat function to submit your questions, and we will be monitoring that throughout. And today's session is being recorded, and I believe it's also being posted by live stream to our Facebook page today as well. For everyone that registered, you will get an email with a link to the recording if you would like to view it later as well. And then the other thing, of course, that it is 2020 and we have Murphy's Law. So if any of the panelists somehow lose their connection, just hang tight with us, and I'm sure they'll be back quickly. So today's plan is that what we will do first is meet our panelists a little bit more in detail. And we'll have Matteo and Peter both introduce their work. And then we'll have a discussion on some key topics. And then we'll save about the last 10 minutes of today's very short 1 hour webinar for your questions. So again, please use the chat function for those questions. All right, so again, welcome everyone. And I am very honored and thrilled to introduce you to both Matteo Bergamini and Peter Tubbs. Matteo Bergamini is an award-winning entrepreneur, founder, and CEO of the youth network Shout Out UK. This is a company he set up at age 22. Shout Out UK's mission is to protect and amplify democracy by ensuring political literacy education is as widespread as possible and available to all citizens in and out of school, regardless of their socioeconomic background, ethnicity, or gender. Matteo has spoken at a range of international locations about his work in political literacy and media literacy, including events at Copenhagen, Sochi, and Vienna. Matteo holds an undergraduate degree in politics and history and a graduate diploma in law from Brunel University, London. He has also given evidence to the House of Lords on media literacy and civic engagement. In 2018, Matteo was nominated by the US Embassy in the UK to participate in the US Department of State's International Visitor Leadership Program, or IVLP. He came to Iowa as part of the IVLP Edward R. Murrow Program for Journalists, and his program centered on promoting discerning consumers of media. Today, in addition to his work at Shout Out UK, Matteo serves as host of the media-minded podcast under Shout Out UK, which explores the bizarre world of misinformation and conspiracies with interviews from the journalists tasked with fighting them. Matteo, welcome back to Des Moines virtually, and would you share a bit more about your work?
Sure, Janet, thank you so much for welcoming me back to Des Moines about virtually. And hopefully when some of this madness calms down, I will be able to visit you all physically. But I'm sure this will do for now. But yeah, thank you very much for that amazing introduction. So as mentioned, my name is Matteo Bergamini, and I run an organization called Shout Out UK. We're a youth network that tries to get more young people engaged and involved in politics by running both political literacy and media literacy programs in secondary schools and colleges. And if we can go to the next slide, what we mean by political literacy is understanding how our system functions. So here in the UK, we don't actually have political education in schools. So quite often, someone can hit 18, be able to vote, but I've never actually talked about how our parliament functions, the role of the monarchy, the House of Lords, and all these kind of basic functions of how our democracy works. And one of the things that we'd always say is that to have a healthy democracy, you need to have a politically literate population that knows how our democracy functions, understands how to get involved with it, but also being media literate, which is how to critically analyze the information we receive and combat misinformation when you come across it. The way we do this, if we go to the next slide, please, is through our e-portal, as well as our offline programs. Offline programs are pretty straightforward. We go into schools and deliver them in schools, either in sessions in classrooms, after school, or during form time. For the online program, schools subscribe to our platform. They get access to all of our resources, as well as teachers CPD, so career professional development workshops, recorded or live. And then the students get their own accounts, so they can go through the programs in real time as and when they would like to. We can go to the next slide. These are just some of the impacts that we've seen through our works. We asked several questions before and after the session, and you can see some of the responses. So one of the questions was, I am confident that if a problem facing my community arose, I would be able to work with others to resolve it. About 17% pre our programs strongly agreed or agree with this statement, whilst 69% strongly agreed and agree with this statement after our programs. If we go on to the next slide. The other question that we asked was, I feel confident to voice my opinion on the issues I care about. Again, 17.4% said strongly agree or agree pre, and then 79.8% said strongly agree and agree post. Just two more technical slides, I promise you. I'm bored on these too much, but next slide. If I wasn't sure a story was true and I wanted to share it, I'd fact check it first. Now, this is massive amount of misinformation, and we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, later on. But 38.7% said that they would fact check it first, whereas 90% said that they would fact check it after our programs. And just one final social impact one that I want to share with you. Another question we asked, I learned enough about politics to make informed decisions about voting. 4% strongly agreed or agree with a statement, and then 65% strongly agreed and agree with this statement, just showing initially the lack of political literacy in schools and the importance of making sure that this stuff is taught to give people confidence in making decisions when it comes to the vote. Going on to the next slide, if I may. Aside from our work in schools around political literacy and education and media literacy and education, we also do a lot around special projects to engage people in democracy. One of the things that we did for the December 2019 general election here in the UK is we ran a voter registration drive with a rapper called Drill Minister. Drill, kind of similar to grime, which you may have something similar in the States, possibly, is a subgenre of music, essentially similar to rap, sort of, where we got this rap artist to create a drill track around voter registration. Again, we're not waiting for young people to come to us. We're going to them and using channels that they engage with to make sure that we reach as wide an audience as humanly possible. If we go to the next slide, this music track was put on SBTV, which is a music channel in the UK, Unilad Sound, which you may have come across, as well as the Mixtape Madness, which has got about, I think it's about 4 million subscribers on YouTube, and the response was incredible. More recently, some of our work, or most of our work, is focused primarily on, as you can imagine, coronavirus misinformation. We've teamed up with the UN and their Verify campaign to do a video to support them in understanding how best to fact check information, as well as creating a series of animations, infographics, all around helping schools better help their kids to understand how to fact check information, as well as finally launching the podcast, as Janet mentioned, called Media Minded, where we interviewed I think it's 10 journalists from about 9 different countries around the world, including someone from the US, around how they're dealing with misinformation. What kind of misinformation are they coming across as journalists, and how are they combating misinformation in their countries? And it's quite interesting that all of them are suffering from the same issue. So every country isn't spared. This is a global issue, or as the UN calls it, an infodemic that we all need to come together and tackle. Because misinformation is a massive issue, and it can lead to very dire consequences if we get misinformed and make actions on that misinformed information, especially when it comes to things like elections or things like pandemics, as we're going through one now. Going to the final slide. So, as puppies aren't just for Christmas, politics and of course media and media literacy isn't just for general elections. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak, and I'm looking forward to the discussion later.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matteo. And you've already given us at least one new term for me, at least, and that's, what was it, infodemic?
Infodemic. Yeah.
We'll come back to that.
I can't take credit for that. That was the UN, but I like it.
Oh, okay. Also joining us today is Peter Tubbs. Peter Tubbs is a lifelong Iowan. He has been working in television since 1990. He has experience in news, documentary, sports, music, and corporate video. Peter has worked at Iowa PBS for 13 years across 2 different periods, the last 4 as producer for Market to Market, a farm business and rural affairs program. Now in its 46th season, Market to Market appears on PBS stations in 24 states and is the longest running program of its kind in the entire PBS system. Peter has also served as a professional host to 3 separate groups of international journalists who were in Des Moines through the Iowa International Center's partnership with the International Visitor Leadership Program. In fact, Peter hosted Matteo's group in 2018 during their brief visit to Central Iowa. Peter, we're very, very happy to have you joining us. And would you share a bit more about your work?
Well, thanks for having me. This is one of the more fun parts of my job that I get to do with you. And the visitors are always fascinating in how everyone has local concerns that when you step back, how similar they are from place to place and town to town. When I travel, I always pick up the local papers. And even though I don't know any of the names, it's always the same issues. My job here at Market to Market, we are a farm business program that runs weekly. We tape on Friday nights and then put it on the satellite. About half of our viewers are here in the state of Iowa. About half are around the country in the other states where it airs. And we're a very technical show in that most of our viewers are either active farmers, or they're grain traders, or commodity traders, or bankers, or they're maybe a generation removed from the farm and they want to know what's going on with their brother or their father who's still back on the farm working, which is both a luxury and a challenge, because we can go deep into a topic because our audience will understand a lot of the nuance. The challenge in that is that you're going deep into a topic, so you have to know what you're talking about. And I know about 5% of the things that I really need to know about. So every day I'm learning about the topic of the week better than what I did on Monday. And we cover a lot of ground. It's more than just growing corn, growing soybeans, raising hogs. I mean, we talk about energy and ethanol, which leads into the global oil production and coal production, natural gas. There's a lot of technology that we have to learn and talk about, all the sorts of things that are emerging, both that are going to end up in the field, but like now this week I'm going to have to do a story about cell-based meat products. And as they're coming online and about to appear in stores and be a competitor with traditional animal grazed proteins. So we cover a lot of ground, and it's always a challenge.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And, you know, even just listening to you both just introduce your work, I know we've talked about a few questions that we'll be discussing here in a moment, but I know I could just go off the cuff and easily fill up an hour with just more questions I've already thought of. So
Right.
I'll try to restrain myself. So again, for our attendees, we encourage you to submit any questions that might come to mind through the chat function. We'll move on now and kind of move into some more general discussion with Peter and Matteo on some key topics. So, gentlemen, one of the first things I wanted to ask you about was your thoughts about the role of social media, such as Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, and their role in controlling certain types of posts and information. For example, Facebook recently announced it would ban posts related to the QAnon conspiracy theories. Do you see this as a form of censorship, or what are your thoughts on that? Matteo, can you start for us, please?
Oh, you know, definitely. I mean, it is censorship. I don't think there's any doubt in that. But is it a good form of censorship? As in, is it a public good? And I think that's quite an interesting thing. Because I would say with stuff like QAnon, or for example, YouTube removing misinformed or just completely false content around coronavirus, for example, I'd see that as a public good. Because I mean, in an ideal world, I would love to see media literacy being entrenched in schools, where all of us had the critical ability to analyze information and take a step back and not be caught out by our own biases and not be misled by this kind of misinformation. The realities, of course, is that most of us don't have those skills, don't have that ability, because it's just not offered in schools. So to kind of firefight this kind of growing trend of misinformation and disinformation, I think social media companies do need to step up and start to say, actually, we don't want to accept this kind of stuff on our platform. And they need to be very careful about it, because it is a private organization essentially removing people's content, and that brings up a whole heap of issues. But I think where it's very, very clearly false information, especially when it comes to things like the pandemic and coronavirus, you're potentially going to harm someone allowing that content to be online. So it's important to have that stuff removed. And not just removed, I would say that actually organizations like Facebook, like Twitter, like YouTube and so forth need to partner with organizations, both as fact checkers, as well as professional journalists and educational organizations, to create a united approach, because them just removing content is kind of pointless in one sense, because yes, you're removing it from the general populace, but people are going to go on Reddit, people are going to go on 4chan, people are going to go on these places and find this information if they really want to. That's the beauty and the curse of the internet. You can find this information if you really want to. So it needs to be a joint, united approach. This is just putting a Band-Aid over a bleeding wound. Like, you need to bring everyone together, all these different organizations to fight. So I say, yes, in the short term, it's a good fix, but it's a very, very short-term fix. We need to have more collaboration.
Interesting. Right. Peter, what are your thoughts on that?
I echo everything Matteo just said, and and for, like, you know, for any given social media platform, it's a pragmatic thing, because you have to police the bad actors, because if you don't, the bad actors will push out all the good actors, and pretty soon all you're left with is a bunch of bad actors. So I know when the social media platforms began, they wanted to have them be viewed as a utility, like an ISP that provides internet service. You know, what I do on the internet and my neighbor does on the internet next door has no bearing. We don't touch each other. But in these platforms, if I'm saying the moon is made of blue cheese and we should go harvest it, other people who maybe are, you know, linked to me because they want to see pictures of my kids, they don't want to see my posts about the moon being made of blue cheese. But they can't avoid it. There's no way. I can't put a filter on, like, okay, my neighbor next door, I only want to see posts about his family. You either get everything or you get nothing. So that's the strength and weakness of each of these platforms. So yeah, you have to police them, or your platform will cease to become usable.
Yeah.
All right. Yes. Matteo, did you have another thought?
I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, it's completely, and it goes into, I think, even more so of a potential spiral when you come into things like social media aggregation. And it's the idea of, you know, if you click on, say, for example, I don't know, you're curious about QAnon, or you're curious about what flat earthers think, for example. You're curious about these kind of like pretty out there, pretty potentially insane theories, but you're just curious. The way social media aggregation works, because at the end of the day, their platforms they're trying to sell you stuff. That's the baseline. And they aggregate content based on what you're interested in. So say, for example, you're interested in this kind of stuff, or you're just curious initially, you then start getting actively suggested videos around what QAnon thinks and whatnot. And eventually, if you keep watching these, that's all you end up seeing. So your version of the world is completely marred by what you've clicked, or is completely skewed by what you've clicked. The best, I mean, one of the most interesting examples, again, when I was on the IVLP program back in 2018 now, I think someone showed me this filter thing that I think it was the Washington, no, it was the New York Times, I think, that has this, but I could be wrong, where you can see two different timelines of someone that is massively pro-Republican and someone that's massively pro-Democrat. And obviously, this is political, but you can take it to anything. Like your world, and the more we spend on social media, the more time we spend on these platforms, that becomes our world. So if you're fixated on just that social media bubble, you end up thinking Trump's the worst human being or the best human being, depending on what your timeline shows you. And again, that's political, but you can take it into things like climate change. You can take it into things like mental health. So your world ends up becoming completely skewed. And then when you have these misinformed narratives coming in, it makes you even more skewed. So it's a very potentially damaging situation to be in. And I think, yeah, platforms do need to react. Albeit dealing with it in the short term, but they do definitely need to react.
I know there have been times when I wanted to find out more about things like QAnon, but I was almost hesitant to look it up because I didn't want to start getting blasted with those things about QAnon. So yeah, it's very challenging. And actually that leads us into our next question. So I am a consumer of information, but you know, one of the scariest things about disinformation is I can read one thing one day, but then read something different the next day. And then I'm left with, all right, which one do I believe? It's really hard to tell what's real and what's not. And so I wondered if you gentlemen might have any advice for consumers on how to manage reading between the lines on different sources of news and information. How do we work with young people to make sure that they have that reaction of not believing the first and only thing that they see, and so that they should check sources as well. So, you know, do you have any advice for consumers as a whole and young people especially? Peter, could you start for us?
You have to almost start with the assumption that anything that's presented to you is baloney, and sort of go from there, unless until you parse out who it is or what site is it coming from. You assume it's baloney, which is unfortunate, but it's the only thing that's probably going to keep you sane and from not chasing a bunch of ghosts off into the wilderness. I have to do, every time something shows up in my feed, I go, wait, I don't know these people, this group, so I'll search it and look at some of their other content and go, oh, okay, no, this seems legit, or no, this is malarkey. I've found over the years on these things that are posted in text on the internet, if you find at the bottom of an article a correction, oh, we misspelled somebody's name in an earlier version of this, that's something you can probably trust because they're at least trying to, for the record, fix their mistakes. If you do a few pages and you don't see any error corrections, they at least don't care enough to correct their errors, which should make you look sideways at them.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that. And just to echo that, I'd say it's not about building cynicism or being cynical about the world or media in general, but it's about building a healthy level of skepticism. And a healthy level of skepticism is not a bad thing. Like being skeptical about what you see or read and just challenging it, like what is it trying to tell you? Because it may not be necessarily misinformed in the sense that it's this kind of false news article. It could be, for example, a comment piece or an opinion piece, in which case you need to know what that thing is. So is it a journalistic article that is trying to convey facts and it's a genuine factual article, or is it a comment piece for example, that in the end it's someone's opinion. You may agree with that opinion or disagree with that opinion, but an opinion and a comment piece are very, very different to actual factual journalism. And differentiating between these things is actually, I'd say, really, really important. So just knowing what you're reading and trying to understand what the message behind that bit of content is. And like Peter said, like if there are corrections, like corrections are good in journalism. Journalists in the end of the day are human beings. They will make mistakes, things will get misspelled, whatever else. But if they're transparent with their corrections, that's a massive positive. If they're transparent with who wrote it, for example, double checking what that journalist has written in the past, looking at the article and being like, well, what kind of quotes have they used? Not just take the quote at face value, but looking, okay, have they sourced this quote? Is it from an academic that has a long history in understanding, say, climate change, for example, or mental health, or whatever it may be? Or is it a random Twitter account that got banned about a week after the article was published? Like, what is the credibility of that article? Is some of the things that I would suggest looking. And obviously, these things take time to do. And a lot of us, you know, when we're scrolling through Instagram or whatever else, the chances are that we're not going to spend massive amounts of time, but we need to start changing our relationship with information. And I think that's one of the fundamental ways that we're going to get rid of this. Rather than looking at something, being shocked, and then retweeting it or sharing it on Instagram or whatever, we need to look at it, be shocked if you want, but then read through it and almost take a critical step back and be like, what is this article trying to tell me? And quite often as well, if I may last point, quite often as well is things around confirmation bias, which is something that is very hard for us to deal with. So understanding that all of us in this chat have a bias. It could be something as I don't know, as harmless as, you know, what kind of dessert I'm going to have for dinner tonight, for example. For me, it's going to be something to do with chocolate because I like chocolate. That's a bias I have. It's a harmless bias, but it's a bias. When it comes to things around religion, ethnicity, race, or whatever else, then those biases become a lot more harmful. But understanding what your biases are can help you be more critical with things you want to believe to be true. Because our critical thinking tends to drop when we look at an article. It's like, I want that to be true. So therefore, I'm going to be less critical about it because I kind of want it to be true, even though I know that if I dig a little deeper, it's probably not going to be. But just understanding ourselves and our biases a little bit more is one of the things I think consumers can do to help them be a bit more critical when engaging with information online.
Right, right. And as far as things like, you know, understanding your biases and, you know, having that reaction to, you know, look a little deeper than just the face value, look for corrections, look for the references within the articles. Matteo, what are you finding in terms of some of the more challenging parts of that young people are struggling with? That, you know, do they understand that those are important, or you know, how does that filter down to a younger consumer of news and information?
In terms of understanding the importance of fact checking and so forth, do you mean?
Right, right,
Yeah.
and bias and things like that.
The bias as well. Yeah, no, definitely. It is. It's definitely something that's filtering down, and I think the next generation coming up are the most tech savvy generation, and in a weird way, although they are not necessarily media literate, that kind of tech savviness makes them almost a little bit more critical in general. So, for example, they will know how easy it is to manipulate a photo because they probably do it for their friends on Instagram anyway. So they're a little bit more aware, I think, of how easy it is to potentially spin a narrative or say something on social media than potentially their parents, for example. So I think there is that, which is quite an interesting positive. However, at the same time, what we're almost seeing is this kind of growing nihilism within the next generation, where it's almost like everything's garbage, nothing is true, all politicians are filth, let's just move away from this, which isn't a helpful narrative to have. Like, healthy skepticism is a good thing, but a complete nihilism where you're painting everybody with the same brush, because it's just not true. Not every politician is bad, not every journalist tells lies, not every commentator is a fraud. Like, that's just not reality. But when you consistently see that kind of narrative being pushed and you start to see everything being untrue, you almost go the complete opposite way. So I think it is filtering, but almost in the most extreme way possible. And it's almost like bringing it back a little bit and being like, well, no, that's being media literate as well. It's about being able to be critical when you look at things, but not automatically assume it's all complete garbage or all completely true, but having that kind of healthy middle ground where you look at it, like Peter said, like, you don't trust it, but you don't think everything's a conspiracy, because when you get to that level, it becomes a problem.
Mhm.
But yes, it's definitely filtering through. It's just almost going the other way now, in a way.
Right, right. I can see where it can swing both ways. And I think a lot of the fatigue, sometimes, just being blasted with information sometimes, helps, unfortunately, almost discourage in making that extra effort with doing that extra research. I know some people in my close personal circle, I drive them crazy because they'll say they read something online and I'll immediately say, well, who was it? And, do you have any other examples of this being posted like this and that type of thing? So I would call myself definitely at least a healthy skeptic, if not maybe a little bit on the cynic side. So another question for you gentlemen, when you're not on the job, if that's even such a thing for you as journalists, what are some of the things that you use what are your primary sources for consumption of news and information? And what are the tools that you use to cross-check and make sure that they're valid? Matteo, would you start?
Sure, yeah. I mean, when you're kind of running your own company, you never really switch off. It's one of those weird blessings and a curse in a way. But in kind of my personal thing, I mean, some of my examples might not be too helpful because they might be a bit UK specific. But for example, I mean, the BBC is a great source of information, just in general, because you can pretty much guarantee that it will be balanced. And as we were saying in the pre-chat earlier, which apparently quite a lot of you heard, the BBC is quite balanced, and you can see it because it's being attacked by both sides for being too left-wing or too right-wing. And if you're getting attacked by both sides equally, you're kind of doing something right. I would say in terms of where I'm sort of verifying information, Full Fact is a really, really good charity that fact checks specifically political news, but just generally fact checks information. I think they are primarily UK centric, but I think the US equivalent is Snopes or Snoops. I always forget to pronounce it, but Snopes is
Snopes.
Utterly, they're utterly amazing. Really, really small team, but really, really good in the way they combat misinformation, and they break it down in an almost weirdly BuzzFeedy way, which I didn't think possible for fact checkers, as they're normally kind of seen as these kind of research, dusty room kind of academics, but they do it in a really engaging way. Then doing Google reverse image search. So when you see something online, doing a Google reverse image search, and then just on the basic things like looking at, and these are just tips that I sort of do in general. When you see an article and when you're going to use a bit of or a resource for an educational piece or whatever else in our programs, like doing basic things like checking the URL, checking who's done it, do a background check on the individual that created the thing online, seeing what they've written elsewhere, looking at the credibility of the organization. These things do take time, but good information does take time to produce, and I think we've got to give it a bit more time by looking at it in a bit more detail, I'll say.
Right. Excellent. Peter?
Let's see, I probably defer to, I have online subscriptions to, 5 different newspapers, and plus I get the print copy of my local one. So my Twitter feed is probably skewed heavy on just journalists in general, and analysts who work in different segments of agriculture, since that's kind of my beat. A lot of academics at universities who work at the different ag schools, who are constantly putting out reams of data and charts and graphs, and here's what happened the last 5 years in this particular thing, and here's where I think it's going. And I find myself reading a lot of just straight economists, and you don't realize how broad the spectrum of economics is until you start reading a bunch of individual writers, because they're all over the place, and they can all they can sit around the table and look at the same plate of food, and you'll have 8 different opinions of it. And so it's interesting to kind of bounce from one opinion to the other and go, okay, that's a good point, okay, that's a good point, okay, somewhere in here it's probably accurate. But yeah, I find myself going to those writers who, especially ones who have a particular beat, they're always doing politics, or they're always doing finance, or always doing something within economics, because they really know their subject area, and they're pretty skilled of sort of parsing out, here's what today's news is, here's where it fits in the context. That's one thing that we have to do on our show, since we're a weekly show. A lot of the things that we talk about our viewers have already heard about because they got it on their phone 24 hours before. But we work really hard to kind of put it in the longer context. Here, here's how this matters compared to 5 years ago, and here's the trend. So that's kind of one place where we can differentiate ourselves, since we aren't in the hustle and bustle, minute to minute news analysis business. You got to do it some other way.
Right, exactly. Let's see. So I'd also like to ask you both, what would you say some of the key topics you're dealing with right now? I mean, that's a really, really broad question, but if you were to think right off the bat, what are some of the things that you've had to deal with most in the last week or month? I mean, a lot can happen in a month, but that type of thing. Peter, what comes to mind for you for your key topics recently?
There was a long stretch where I was doing an almost weekly story on trade policy, on both agricultural and, the US versus the world in general. And we were always asking the question, since a noted politician apparently doesn't understand how tariffs work, we would almost weekly have a soundbite saying, and the Chinese are paying the tariffs. And we would put the soundbite in, and then my first graph after that would say, tariffs are paid by American consumers and American importers. And there is a school of thought that by simply putting the incorrect statement in the piece adds validity to the incorrect statement. And so we argue, do we even put that in? But that's been kind of the crux driving US policy for, 3.5 years now. So we keep putting it in, we keep trying to say, no, this is actually incorrect. Here's what really happened. Mm-hmm. Yes, but that's the kind of thing we debate in our aisle when we're putting the show together.
Right. Right. And Matteo?
Yeah, no, I mean, for me, probably straight off the bat would be COVID misinformation has been a recurring theme for us probably since March. And I mean, more specific than that, I mean, the 5G COVID conspiracy that you probably will have heard of, judging by the laughs, has been a recurring one, like debunking it, looking at creating different bits of misinformation and trying to find other examples other than that to talk about has been kind of the main focal point. Like the amount of misinformation around COVID that we've been sent, that we've been tackling or creating resources again has just been shocking. From vitamins that are supposed to cure you of the virus to 5G being the reason. In the UK, we've had the 5G conspiracy was accidentally promoted by a bunch of celebrities. So it got spread quite wildly here, and we ended up having 20 phone masts get burnt down because of it. A lot of them actually weren't 5G phone masts either, by the way, just to be on the clear side. So that's been a big one. The other thing for us has been elections. So obviously the elections in the UK, the local ones and the mayoral ones in London have been postponed. And just to let yourselves know, and obviously you guys have got quite a big election coming up soon, and if you're facing election fatigue, just bear in mind that we're going to be in the same boat next year with the English local elections, the 13 different mayoral elections across England. We're going to have the Scottish election, the Welsh election, London mayoral and assembly elections, and the police and crime commissioner elections, all in the same 2 months. Yeah. So that's been quite a hot topic, because we do a lot around voter registration drives and democratic engagement. So it has been a hell of a couple planning meetings, but yeah, those two have been pretty big topics.
Great. Matteo shared that story about the phone tower, the cell phone towers with me, and 5G, and that 5G was the conspiracy was that 5G towers would spread COVID. Is that right?
Yeah, basically, yeah. I mean, it goes crazier than that, but let's just stick with that.
Yeah, it's, it reminds me of that old, what they call the telephone game. You have a line of people, and first person starts with a sentence, and each person whispers to the next, and it's completely different by the time it ends up at the last person. Yeah, so a lot of things just don't change, do they? So Matteo, I do have a question for you specifically also. And I wondered if you could share with us, so during your IVLP program in the US, you traveled with a group of other European journalists. And so one of the things that we never hear from my side of the program is what happens after you get home. So could you share, if you've been in touch with any of the other journalists that you went on that program? I mean, you were 3 weeks together in the US from several different cities, traveling to several different cities. So what's in your conversations with these other journalists, what's your impression of some of the issues they're facing combating disinformation?
Yeah, no, definitely. So the first, just to go on the first part of your question, I mean, yeah, I've been in touch with almost, I'd say almost everyone from my IVLP still. In fact, I'm going to embarrass him now, but one of the IVLP alumni from my group is actually in the chat right now. Is actually one of the attendees. He might accidentally drop off after me mentioning him, but hi, Harris, good to see you. But yeah, no, so we're still very much in touch, and I've been talking, I mean, primarily sharing sort of depressing stories about COVID and misinformation and whatnot in the last couple of months. But we've been working together. So for example, on the Media Minded podcast, out of 10 of the journalists on there, I'd say 7 were from IVLP alumni, were from my cohort. So interviewed one of the IVLP alumni from Moldova, Italy, Cyprus as well, and so forth. Like the network's incredible. And when they couldn't be the interviewer, they connected me with someone that was a journalist over there that could support with the interview. We've also applied for cross-European projects together as well. Still waiting to hear from one of them, fingers crossed. But yeah, no, it's just been incredible. And in terms of what kind of misinformation they've been facing, it's interesting because it's all very much the same situation, and it's this kind of it all stemmed from the initial fear of the pandemic. And every country, no matter how large or how small, went through that same bit where the moment the pandemic hit and everybody was aware of it, government, scientists, journalists were all trying to scramble to find something, to get some factual evidence or information to understand what the situation was. And because of that time lapse between when we started to know something was wrong and then when the information started to come out, it created that kind of vacuum, which mis and disinformation artists essentially filled up with garbage. I mean, I remember at one point talking to someone that I'd been sent this thing saying that, oh, if you hold your breath for like a minute or something and you don't cough, then you haven't got coronavirus. And I remember doing it and then kind of thinking to myself, this is obviously rubbish. Like, why am I doing this thing? But again, when you're in this kind of panicked mentality, or when you are in that moment of like hype and you're like, you want a quick response, you want to know if you've got this thing or not, your kind of rationale goes out the window. And every single journalist from every country that I spoke to that was on the RVP said the same thing. I mean, one of the journalists, for example, that I interviewed in Cyprus, this guy, Nicholas, who's actually in the picture that you had at the beginning, he was telling me as well that how 5G had hit Cyprus, that conspiracy had hit Cyprus, and they'd burned down a phone mast that had been there for, I think he said, like 20, 40 years. And Cyprus weren't even considering bringing 5G in yet. But that kind of doesn't matter. So it's all vaguely the kind of same sort of things. And then there are sort of regional variants, like with the journalist Matteo in Italy, for example, talked about how there was a lot in Italy around sort of vitamin C and how vitamin C was meant to help you combat the virus. Again, none of it's true. Vitamin C is healthy for you, but it's not going to help you suddenly get rid of this virus. So it's all very similar situations, which is why I think we're all facing vaguely the same thing. And this is why it needs a kind of borderless, bringing everybody together approach to combating misinformation, because it doesn't matter where you are. You will know someone that has shared it. You will know someone that believes in it, or you will have seen these posts online. Whether you're in the States, Italy, the UK, Poland, wherever, it doesn't matter.
I think that's fascinating that you're able to create that mesh, that network, and to share that commonality. And for whether it be from the actual facts and cross-checking what's being said in Poland or Italy, all the way down through the more seemingly ridiculous theories, And, you know, heck, if you say laughter is the best medicine, maybe it's that outlet that provides, you know, a little bit of a break also. So, so that's wonderful that you've been able to stay in touch with them. I would like to thank the attendees who have submitted questions, and we do have a few questions that we'd like to shift to now. And one of the things that we were talking about, what happens with social media and algorithms that shift based on what you've actually done through social media. So with these algorithms that can skew that information, how do you suggest mitigating that impact on what you see after you look up QAnon just to find out what it is, for example? Peter, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I guess if you do some research on one topic and you kind of want to clear that from from the algorithm, you go and you search a whole bunch of other stuff that's completely unrelated, and it will at least put something different into the algorithm. It may not be better, but at least it's different. If you have cast really broad footprints, the algorithm may not know what to latch onto. So,
oh, excellent.
That's the only. It's not really an answer, but that's something that I do. Is just I find random topics and search on them for 10 minutes, and then for a few days my Google ads are really weird. So, yeah.
Right. Have you ever tried that, Matteo?
I have not, but I'm going to. I mean, I'm kind of glad you did that question first, Peter, because that is a hard one to answer. I mean, my social media and YouTube history is completely shot up just purely because of the work we do around misinformation. Sometimes I just spend ages having to research this kind of misinformation, so I get it quite regularly, and I kind of made peace with that reality. I'd say on a serious note, I think knowing that these algorithms exist and that's what's happening, I think is half the battle. Just being aware that what you're seeing is not the full picture, and you are being targeted by these companies to get clicks from you, to engage with certain content that you've supported before. Just makes you aware that that's not the full picture. And as long as you know that and you're aware of that, you can then do something about it, i.e. when you've read an article about something, or you've read a couple of posts that skew in one direction, going out your way to research the opposite view, for example, or an alternative view from another publication. These networks don't stop you from researching this stuff. Just because you've liked a couple of things, or you've gone down the rabbit hole of QAnon a couple, doesn't mean you can't go back to reality and go on to, I don't know, BBC or PBS or whatever it may be, to kind of have that opposing view. So I think knowing that these things are happening on social media networks is, I think, half the battle. Then the other thing that you can do is make sure you follow reputable news sites. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you what a reputable news site looks like, but knowing that you have several reputable news sites that you follow that have different skews potentially, because the things that you follow, you then get recommended those posts anyway. So those kind of circumvent almost the navigation. So it's not like you're not going to be recommended those things that you follow. You will still be recommended those on top of the algorithm post that you get followed. So I'd say being aware and then following a variety of different publications and news sites that have varying different opinions will at least allow you to see in your timeline different things, and then allow you to be aware of that and then go and search for that alternative. But it's not an easy thing to sort.
Yeah.
This is another totally pragmatic suggestion, but even opening a browser window in incognito mode on Chrome, you're not leaving as many of those footprints behind for the algorithm to chew on. So for better or worse, again, it's not a solution, but the algorithm is completely passive. It has no idea what thing you're curious about and what thing you really care about. So what you feed it, kind of, if you feed it a bunch of random things, it's not going to know what to latch onto, or you can hide from it.
Right. And Peter, one of the attendees actually shared that your answer about confusing the search algorithm is a strategy from The Art of War, which I believe is like a very, very, very old Chinese,
a fine book. Yes, I've read it. Yeah, I would have never drawn that comparison. That's excellent.
Which
I
is
wish I was
Sue's
that
Art of War,
clever. Yes, I wish I was that clever to say, oh yes, I read it from The Art of War, and this is what I do.
See, now you can claim it. Sure.
I'll take that, Peter. I'll take that comment.
Let's see. Oh gosh, we've had some wonderful questions here. Let's see. So the next one was on fact-checking websites. If there's a way to learn about what their criteria and bias is, to learn what they're using to determine what's valid, and what they're how you can trust them. And if you know of a good fact-checking website, what makes you have confidence in it, I guess.
Snopes is solid. I'm showing my age. I remember back in the day when everything was blog based, and most bloggers would have on one of the sides would be like other blogs I link to or I get my content from. You could sort of quickly understand, oh, this is where this person sits. I realize that's now I'm talking about, Model Ts and buggy whips and things, but sort of see, if you read a source long enough, you get a sense for who are they linking to, who are they pulling a quote from, and then writing about it. And so you can, but that again, that's an experience. It takes a while to figure that out. If someone sends you something from a particular site, go to that site, go to the main URL and just start looking at their content in aggregate. Go to their front page and you'll get a sense of, oh, this is a real news site. This looks a little sketchy. This is a total opinion site. Okay, that's fine. You have to kind of take a step back and look at their work in aggregate.
And just to quickly add on that, and it's an interesting question because who fact checks the fact checkers almost. And I think it's because that could be a never-ending spiral. But the thing that, so with Snopes and Full Fact in the UK, like the thing that makes me trust them implicitly, like Full Fact, I mean, with Snopes, just to give you one story or one fact check that I remember that they went through was the Obama ring that President Obama used to wears, I think still, which had a bunch of squiggles on it, and there's a bunch of misinformation that went around saying that what was actually written on there in Arabic was the phrase, what was it, like, there is no God but Allah, something like that. And basically Snopes went really aggressively into fact checking that, and the detail that they go through is why you trust them, because they went into huge amounts of detail. They weren't sketchy on any of their sources. They showcased who the Arabic translators were. They got, I think, 7 different Arabic translators with different directs to look at that, and all the different ones were like, yeah, that's a squiggle. That's definitely a squiggle. It's a nice squiggle, but it's definitely a squiggle. And you could check who these Arabic translators were. Some of them were academics, some of them were professional translators. So you can really trust it by the level of insane detail that they go into to debunk a story. Full Fact do it in a similar way in terms of statistics and UK politics. The trouble with Full Fact, which is why I kind of veer more towards Snopes, is that they can get very academic very quickly, and because it's curated by a bunch of different universities. So these people are very, very detail orientated, and it can get, like, again, massive amounts of detail. But that can sometimes be also your undoing, because it depends whether you care that much to read that entire dossier of why this thing is false or not. But Snopes have the kind of nice balance, because it is short enough, but also long enough to give you that kind of trust and credibility. And the other thing is, you can check how credible a fact checker is by checking their funding and how transparent they are in their funding. Because both with Snopes and with Full Fact, and I'm sure there are others, but they escape me, but those two, very transparent with who their funders are. You can see exactly where their funding comes from. You can see exactly where their money's being spent. And again, that gives you a real, at least for me, that gives me a real sense of, like, these people are credible. They're the real deal. They're not getting money from states. They're not getting money from random shady people. This is all either public donations or from very, very specific foundations that combat this kind of stuff.
Right, right. Excellent. I love that idea. I didn't even know that was possible. So learning stuff all the time. So one more question for you both, just to kind of maybe lighten things up a little bit, is, out of curiosity, we've talked about some of the things that you've run across as far as disinformation around 5G and the phone towers and things like that. Are there any other, you never thought you would hear this type of stories that you've heard around COVID-19, the pandemic, et cetera, that we haven't had a chance to share and maybe chuckle at a little bit?
The 5G one is good. Although it's funny, just last week, I stumbled on, like locally here in my town, someone who was upset that they were installing 5G on the pole outside their house and how there was an approval process and should the neighborhood be notified. And their concern that 5G causes, they didn't say COVID specifically, but like every other ailment you can get. And yet they apparently are unaware of like the vast amounts of magnetic spectrum from all kinds of things that we've been living with for hundreds of years. And there hasn't been any evidence that any of that other stuff does anything specific. So why this particular frequency, I don't fully get. So I just, yeah, that's one I don't get. There's all kinds of conspiracies I can sort of go down the road with a little bit, but that one just, it's a non-starter for me. I don't.
Right. Matteo?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like funny or sort of humorous conspiracies, I think 5G is definitely a winner. But I mean, this is a little story that I saw recently coming from the UK, where again, from the sort of 5G standpoint, but basically this person or this 5G conspiracy theorist, I thought he'd found proof that 5G was a thing, because he managed to go into, you know, when you go onto your Wi-Fi and you're kind of searching for Wi-Fi and so forth, and he was going around London and he came across COVID 5G network on the Wi-Fi. And he saw this as conclusive proof, and he was going into different hotspots in London, and he found different Wi-Fi networks with this name. What apparently had transpired is this comedian in the UK was leaving little Wi-Fi hotspots around with that name to trick people, and then it came up with this massive reveal to sell tickets to his show, his online show. It was brilliant. Like it was probably the most genius bit of marketing I've ever seen. But these people fully believed it. It was all over their Facebook pages. They were like, this is conclusive evidence. We need to protest in London, all this kind of nonsense. And in fact, in one of the protests, I think Jeremy Corbyn's brother, one of our the brothers of one of the leaders of our opposition parties, went down there with them because he's a 5G conspiracy theorist. And again, they did all this kind of stuff, and it was all just a hoax by this comedian, which I thought was brilliant. Like gullibleness is genuine, is definitely well and alive in 2020. And the other thing for me probably is the flat earthers. I've been watching quite a few documentaries on Netflix about the flat earthers, and that for me has been, it's not related to COVID at all. But for me, that has been, I don't get it. I find it funny, but I really don't get it.
Two quick comments before we leave. For about 6 months, there was a Wi-Fi network in my neighborhood named FBI Surveillance Van Number 7. You know, someone being funny with the name. And yeah, I love the flat Earth thing, because if the Earth really was flat, wouldn't there be a super expensive luxury cruise out to the end of the Earth? I mean, think of what they could charge for that.
Yeah, that's entrepreneurism at its best.
Right.
Or worse.
Right.
I mean, Peter, I think if journalism if producing doesn't pan out or whatever else, me and you, we can start a business. We can get we can set it up in Iowa and go to these conventions and start to sell tickets, because if they believe enough to go to these conventions, I think they'll buy the tickets. I think we've got a post-COVID business plan.
I'll have my people call your people and set up a meeting. We'll get that going. Yeah.
And I'll be the Snopes keeping an eye on you too. Well, thank you so much. And Matteo, I did want to mention that your buddy Harris shared a little bit about what a great job you're doing in the UK. So we'll send that as well. So I did want to thank you both. And I believe Pat Grote can join us again to kind of wrap us up and take us out. Pat?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Matteo, for joining us. It's been quite an interesting conversation. I would have never guessed that we would have gone to FBI surveillance vehicles and other things, but it's been a great conversation, informational, entertaining, and just connects us all again literally across the world today. So thank you for joining us. For those of you who are tuning in, we look forward to having you on our next global conversation in November. So thank you all. Have a great day, and we will see you. Bye-bye.